So what did Jesus really mean when he commanded his followers to make disciples in the Great Commission? How does that fit with what we're actually doing today? Find out. You're having coffee with Conrad on
Conrad Rocks!
Welcome to yet another edition of Coffee with Conrad. This is Conrad from ConradRocks.net. Rocks of revelation being poured out to you. Now, you know my passion is for you, yes, you, to have a spiritual relationship with the biblical Jesus. Now, speaking of this biblical Jesus, today I'm going to be exploring what first century discipleship was actually like. We're going to be talking about what Jesus probably really meant when he said to make disciples of all nations, and we're going to look at the stark contrast between what we're doing today and what Jesus most likely originally intended. Buckle up.
We are having coffee with Conrad at ConradRocks.net. Jesus rules!
Man, I'm going to tell you, I really enjoyed doing this research for this podcast. It was a lot of fun. But it's also alarming. In the time of Jesus and the early church, the process of making disciples looked very different than what it does today in the Western church. Discipleship was a lifelong commitment where followers would travel and live alongside their rabbi. You know, think about how the disciples went with Jesus wherever he went. They would closely observe and imitate the teachings and way of life of the rabbi that they were following. Now, the goal was not just to accumulate knowledge, but to become a living copy of the rabbi. They would embody his interpretation of the Torah in daily life. Now, becoming a disciple was seen as a significant personal sacrifice, as it often required leaving one's business, your family, and your previous way of life behind. That's gone. Now, in contrast, discipleship today is often presented as a path to comfort, prosperity, and personal fulfillment rather than sacrifice. Furthermore, the early disciples faced intense persecution and even suffering for their faith, which was seen as a badge of honor in a way to share or partake in the sufferings of Christ, like Paul writes about. In contrast, modern Western Christianity often avoids or minimizes suffering, seeking comfort instead. So in this podcast, we're going to explore some of the key differences between the discipleship practices of the first century, and I think that's what Jesus had in mind. We're going to, in the first century, how they were making disciples back then, and then we're going to compare that a little bit with the 21st century American church. So by understanding this original context and intent behind Jesus' call to make disciples, we may uncover some fresh insights to revitalize our own approach to following and imitating Jesus Christ. Faith in first century Israel was a lot different than it is today, very much so. People looked up to sages. That's what they would call a rabbi, was a sage back then. They would look up to them with the utmost respect. Pretty much everyone in Israel knew the Torah fairly well, as opposed to how hardly anyone knows scriptures today. You know that we go out and minister out in the Bible Belt, and we'll ask questions, where are you with Jesus? And a lot of people won't know that Moses parted the Red Sea or how many disciples Jesus had, so it's a lot different than it was back then. But being a sage back then was looked upon as a worthwhile pursuit. It's kind of like, kids look up to the Super Bowl winning quarterback today, right? So it was a big deal. In first century Judaism, young boys would begin their religious education at a very early age, typically around 5 or 6 years old. They would start by attending a local synagogue school called a Bet Sefer, where they would learn to read and write and begin memorizing the Torah. Yeah, can you imagine memorizing the Torah at 5 or 6? But that's what they did. Now, the best students, they would progress to the next level of education at around 10, called a Bet Midrash. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that right. Got this from reading books. Anyway, they would study the oral law and learn how to apply the Torah to everyday life. Only the most exceptional students would continue on their studies beyond this point. So at around age 15, the top students would seek out a rabbi to become their mentor. They would apply to become the rabbi's talmidim, or disciples. This was a very highly competitive process, as a rabbi would only select the best of the best to be his disciples. So once selected, the talmidim would quite literally follow the rabbi wherever he went, eating with him, traveling with him, and imitating his every action in an attempt to become just like the rabbi or the sage that they're following. The goal was not just to learn, from the rabbi, but to become like the rabbi in every way possible. So this provides important context where Jesus is called to his disciples. When he said, "Follow me," you notice how they immediately dropped everything. They dropped their nets, they dropped their vocations, they left their families, and they followed Jesus. This was a huge honor and a privilege. In that culture, in that time, being chosen by a respected rabbi or sage was like being drafted by a championship team. It meant leaving everything behind to devote oneself to fully becoming like the rabbi in every way. The disciples knew that this was a life-changing invitation to a deeply intimate relationship with Jesus, so they left everything. They were ready to learn from Jesus, imitate him, and be transformed by him. Historically, discipleship under a rabbi was a significant commitment that typically involved a multi-year dedication and a close, very close, daily relational living experience with the rabbi. The process aimed at training the disciples to surpass the rabbi in knowledge and practice of the Torah. So the relationship between the rabbi and the disciple was very intense. It was very personal, with the disciple closely observing, imitating, and learning from the rabbi. The disciples were expected to eventually become teachers themselves, passing on the lifestyle and teachings to their own disciples, thus perpetuating the tradition of discipleship from generation to generation. So this makes sense when Jesus commands his disciples to make disciples of all nations and to teach them to observe whatsoever Jesus has commanded them. So this command that Jesus did in the Great Commission means it should go perpetuate throughout generations. Imitating the rabbi. Now, in the context of discipleship under a rabbi in the first century, disciples were expected to do more than just acquire the knowledge of the rabbi. The goal was not merely to know what the rabbi knows, but to become like the rabbi in character, behavior, and lifestyle. So this involved a deep personal commitment to imitating the rabbi's way of life. So imitation was a key aspect of discipleship. Disciples were expected to follow their rabbi very closely, observing his actions, his words, and his attitude. They were to emulate his way of praying. Remember when they asked Jesus, "Hey, teach us how to pray?" They would emulate his way of praying, studying, teaching, and serving others. This was not just about copying external behaviors, but about internalizing the values, attitudes, and priorities of the rabbi. So the disciples' goal was to become a living copy of the rabbi, embodying his interpretation of the Torah in their own life. Take my yoke upon you. Now, you know the phrase, "take my yoke upon you and learn from me," is found in Matthew 11:29 of the King James Bible. In this context, the term yoke is used metaphorically, of course. Taking Jesus' yoke upon oneself symbolizes submission and commitment to discipleship. And I believe that this gives new light on the collaboration of the great co-mission with Jesus. So Jesus is with us in our struggles, and his way is easy and it gives us rest. And what I believe that means is that when we follow Jesus, there's this peace that surpasses all understanding. There's this inner peace because deep down, we know that we're doing the right thing, and there's some peace in that. So the invitation to take Jesus' yoke and learn from him is accompanied by the promise of finding rest for one's soul. This rest is associated with the ease and lightness of Jesus' yoke, suggesting that following his teachings brings a sense of relief and spiritual comfort. You just You've got inner peace when you follow Jesus. That's just how it is. In this world, you're going to have troubles, but with Jesus, you have this peace that surpasses all understanding. Also in first century Israel, Jesus said, carry the cross. There was this carry the cross mentality. So Jesus' call to discipleship was not just an invitation to learn stuff, but it was a summon to sacrifice. In Luke 9:23-24, Jesus says, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. So these words here reveal the radical nature of first century discipleship. Following Jesus means being willing to suffer and even die for him. It means loving Jesus more than family, more than comfort, more than life itself. The disciples in the first century understood this call. They knew that to follow their rabbi meant to surrender everything. They had to be ready to bear the cross just as he did. This is why Jesus says that we must hate our parents. Remember, he said that in Luke 14:26, in comparison to our love for him. They left their families, okay? It's not a literal call to hate your parents, but a vivid way of expressing the supreme devotion to Jesus. The disciples were prepared to die for Jesus, or, the first century disciples were prepared to die for the rabbis, just as the rabbi was expected to lay down his life for them. This is talked about a lot in the Bible. So this was the depth of commitment that a true discipleship required, a willingness to bear the cross, to lose one's life for Christ's sake, and so find true life in him. So in the time of Jesus and the early church, suffering and persecution were parts of the discipleship journey. Following Jesus came at a very great personal cost. The disciples were expected to be willing to give up their livelihoods, their families, even their lives to follow Jesus. This level of commitment was the norm. It's not the exception. And today I'm thinking about how people will sign up for the military nowadays, knowing full well that they might die. I mean, they could possibly die. However, instead of dying following the orders from their government, they're willing to die for their faith in Jesus. The early Christians faced intense persecution from both the Jewish religious authorities, we can see that in Scripture, and the Roman Empire. They were arrested. They were beaten. They were even martyred for their faith. So this suffering, though, they had a different perspective about it. It was seen as a badge of honor, a way to partake in the sufferings of Christ, like Paul talks about. Persecution actually helped strengthen the faith of the early believers. It's amazing, but it fueled the rapid growth of the church. As more people witnessed the courage and faithfulness of the disciples, it drew others to the message of Christ. So now if we contrast that with what we have today in the Western church, suffering and persecution are often avoided or minimized. Discipleship is often presented as a path to comfort, prosperity, and personal fulfillment rather than carrying the cross and sacrifice. The cost of following Jesus is downplayed. Christians in the West generally face far less overt persecution than the early church, of course. But while discrimination does exist, outright violence and martyrdom are very rare in most contexts. So the lack of persecution can lead to a soft, comfortable, powder puff Christianity that's more focused on personal happiness and self-fulfillment rather than radical obedience to Christ, the carrying your cross mentality. The refining fire of suffering is missing today.
What if you could experience the Bible's supernatural world in your everyday life? That's what happened to Conrad Carricker. Tormented by dark forces and unseen attackers as a child, Conrad sought truth through New Age practices and psychic readings. But everything changed when he met Jesus Christ in a powerful personal way. In Open Your Eyes, My Supernatural Journey, Conrad vulnerably shares his journey from the occult to the kingdom of God. Discover amazing accounts of angelic visitations, spiritual warfare, prophetic visions, and hearing the voice of God. If you're hungry for a deeper spiritual reality, Open Your Eyes, My Supernatural Journey will challenge you to renounce darkness, pursue intimacy with Jesus, and walk in the supernatural power of the Holy Spirit. Get your copy on Amazon now and let the adventure begin.
So now we've talked a lot about first century Israel and some of the core precepts of being a disciple under a rabbi or a sage back then. Now I'm going to move and talk about some of the contrasts between what Jesus meant and what we do today. One of the contrasts here is sacrifice versus comfort. In the early church, becoming a disciple was seen as a significant personal sacrifice. In contrast, discipleship today is presented as a path to comfort, prosperity, and personal fulfillment, as opposed to sacrifice. I mean, think of Jesus saying, carry your cross, versus the free coffee we get at the singles group fellowship. See what I'm saying? It's a lot different. Sacrifice versus comfort. Now, another thing I want to talk about is the relational learning versus the classroom teaching. You probably heard me talk about the learning pyramid several times. The least effective way of learning is the lecture model. In the early church, discipleship was deeply relational and it was an immersive experience. Disciples learned by closely observing and imitating the rabbi in every aspect of life. They walked with him, they ate with him, they absorbed his teachings in the way he simply just existed in the world. This was a very hands-on approach, life-on-life apprenticeship. You remember when they, hey, let's go to the other side, and here comes the demoniac at 1,000 miles an hour. You know, what do you do, Peter? I mean, this was hands-on discipleship. So in contrast here, the modern discipleship, if you can even call it that, relies on a more classroom-style teaching and curriculum-based programs. We tend to emphasize the transfer of information from one person to the next instead of the transformation of lives. Jesus, on the other hand, taught in a highly interactive and engaging way. He would answer questions with questions, pushing his disciples to think deeply and discover truth for themselves. He also taught by demonstration, involving his disciples in his ministry and letting them learn by doing. Today, we often use an uninterrupted monologue. You hear me talk about that all the time. And this quells the questions and answer dialogue like we can see Jesus having with his disciples. Jesus welcomed questions and saw them as opportunities to guide his disciples into greater understanding of deeper truths. Jesus' teaching was never just a one-way lecture, but a dynamic relational process of discovery and growth. Jesus didn't just want his disciples to know more information. He wanted them to become more like him. That kind of transformation happens not just in a classroom setting, but in the context of shared life in ministry, one-on-one ministry. As we seek to make disciples today, we need to recapture this essence, this relational apprenticeship model that Jesus has laid out for us so powerfully. Now, another contrast that I would like to point out is disciple making as the core mission. Now, in the Great Commission, Jesus gave his followers a clear and compelling mission. Go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. For the early church, this command was a driving force behind everything that they did. Disciple making wasn't just one ministry among many. It was the heartbeat of the church. Every believer saw themselves as a disciple maker. They were called to share the gospel. They were called to baptize new believers and teach them to obey what Jesus has commanded. In stark contrast, disciple making has taken a back seat in modern churches. Other priorities often take precedence, such as numerical growth. The church is hugely focused on attracting crowds and increasing attendance than on making committed disciples. Success is measured by bodies in seats rather than lives transformed. Programs and events. Churches can get caught up in a whirlwind of activities, worship services, classes, conferences, special events that may entertain or they may transfer information at best, but they don't necessarily produce mature disciples. Look at the focus on buildings and facilities. Significant time, money, and energy can be poured into maintaining and upgrading physical spaces, sometimes at the expense of investing in people. Institutional maintenance. Churches can become preoccupied with preserving traditions, structures, and institutions and losing the sight of disciple-making mission. So while these things aren't necessarily bad, okay, they're not necessarily bad in and of themselves, but they can distract from the primary call of Jesus' command in the Great Commission to make disciples. So we've traded the relational life-on-life model of Jesus for the programmatic classroom-style approach. We've made discipleship a compartmentalized activity rather than the all-encompassing lifestyle it was for the early believers in the early church. Now, I want you to think about this. Jesus didn't command us to make converts, church members, or attenders. He called us to make disciples. Think about that for a little bit. Fully devoted followers who would give their lives to imitate Jesus and become disciple makers themselves. This was the core mission of the early church, and it needs to be recaptured as the driving priority for the church today. So again, making disciples isn't just about transfer of information. It's about transformation. It's not a 12-week course, but a lifelong journey. It doesn't happen primarily in a classroom, lecture, or sanctuary, but in the context of a shared life service and mission. And, it's not the job of pastors and professionals. A lot of people see it that way, but it's the privilege and responsibility of every believer. As the church, we need to realign our priorities and practices with Jesus' original intent. We need to measure success not by seating capacity, but by sending capacity. Our ability to equip and release disciples into a life of kingdom impact. So we need to raise our focus on relational discipleship. We need to prioritize people over projects, mission, or over maintenance. In short, we need a radical return to the disciple-making heart of Jesus in the early church. This is the only way we'll fulfill our God-given mission and see the world transformed around us by the power of the gospel. Disciple-making can no longer be one of the things that we do. It must become the main thing, the driving force behind everything else. This is what Jesus meant, and this is what I believe he still calls us to today. Empowerment of all believers. I wanted to touch on something a little bit more. A lot of people think that it's just the job of the clergy to make disciples, but in the early church, all disciples were expected to become disciple makers themselves, right? Today, disciple making is often seen as a job of professional clergy or a select few rather than the calling of every believer. So we need to get back to that. All right, I'm going to talk about embracing persecution a little bit more. With the early disciples, persecution was seen not just as something to be endured. And I think that's the way that we look at it today. But persecution, then, and you can get this from the text too, it was a privilege and a sign of faithfulness to Christ. Remember how they rejoiced that they were counted worthy to be beaten for Christ? I mean, they're not looking at that as something to endure, but they were partakers of Christ's sufferings, okay? The apostles rejoiced when they were counted worthy to suffer shame for Jesus' name. That's in Acts 5:41. Paul even said, "For to you it has been granted on behalf of Christ not only to believe in him, but also to suffer for his sake." Philippians 1:29. So suffering was seen as a way to relate or identify with Christ and share in his sufferings. We get to know him better that way. So in contrast, Much of Western Christianity that we have today not only avoids persecution, but often sees it as a sign of failure or a lack of faith. Prosperity theology, for example, teaches that suffering means you don't have enough faith. Now, many Christians today, they'll pray for deliverance from all trials rather than the strength to endure them faithfully. The health and wealth gospel promises material blessings, not a cross to carry, like Jesus says. However, Jesus said, he promised, that the world would hate his followers just as it hated him. John 15:18-20. So the absence of persecution may actually be a sign that the church has become too much like the world, comfortable, lukewarm. A comfortable, compromising Christianity may avoid suffering, but also lacks the power of a courageous countercultural faith. So as the church, I believe we need to recover the biblical perspective that suffering for Christ is normal and even necessary part of discipleship. I know that's hard to swallow, but what does the Bible say? We need to stick with what Jesus says, and we need to live out his words. Transformational lifestyle versus information transfer. So here's a few additional thoughts to expand on the contrast between the transformational lifestyle and information transfer in discipleship that we have today. In the early church, discipleship was not just about acquiring knowledge, but about the complete transformation of one's life, their values, their character. The disciples didn't just learn what Jesus taught, they learned to live as he lived, to pray the way he prayed, to do the things that he did. So this meant a radical reorientation of priorities, relationships, and daily habits. Discipleship touched every area of life, from how they treated their neighbors, to how they handled their money, to whether they kicked their dog or not. You know what I'm saying? So in contrast, much of modern discipleship can be reduced to a transfer of information. You know how we're always going to Bible studies to learn something about the text. We focus on teaching people what to believe, but not necessarily how to live, especially when you think about how Jesus taught his disciples to live. Also think about this. Discipleship is often compartmentalized to 30 minutes on Sunday mornings or a midweek Bible study, rather than being integrated into every aspect of daily life. We measure success by how much people know, rather than how much they've grown Christ-like in character. Also, true discipleship is not just about behavior modification or external conformity to a set of rules. It's about the inner transformation of the heart and the mind, right? We got to have a new heart, a new mind, got to be transformed. Paul wrote, "Do not be conformed to the pattern of this world, but be transformed." We've got to be, it's metamorphosis. That's the original Greek. We have to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Romans 12:2, we all know that passage. This transformation happens as we develop a deep, abiding relationship with Jesus, allowing his Spirit to shape us from the inside out. So ultimately, the goal of discipleship is to become more like Jesus in every way, in our thoughts, in our attitudes, actions, and relationships. It's a lifelong journey of growth and transformation, not just a short-term program or class. As disciples, we are called not to just know about Jesus, you hear me say this all the time, but to follow him, imitate him, and be conformed to his image. This is the essence of transformational discipleship that the early church modeled, and we need to recapture that today. So in this podcast, we've explored some of the stark differences between early discipleship practices. You know, I was trying to get into the crux of what Jesus really meant when he said, make disciples of all nations. What was that? What did that look like back then? So I think we dug into that pretty well. And we also contrasted that with what we all know, the American Western Church in 2024. So by understanding the original context and the intent behind Jesus' call to make disciples, we can gain a fresh insight And I believe that it'll help us revitalize our approach to following and imitating Christ. I want you to be inspired to embrace the sacrificial, relational, and transformational nature of true discipleship, just as the early disciples did. Hopefully we can get there. Hopefully we've learned something here. Now, I'm going to be including a couple of links to sources of information where I got a lot of the information for this podcast. One of them is a book called Sitting at the Feet of Rabbi Jesus. And then there's this other amazing playlist called Rabbis and Disciples from Walking the Text on YouTube. It'll blow you away. I'm going to put the links in there. But if you cannot, for some reason, if this link doesn't work, just search for Rabbis and Disciples and you'll see this playlist. And I got a lot of the information from there. It's pretty amazing. I want to thank you for being in my life. If this podcast has touched you, please share it to someone you think might benefit from it. Till we meet again, dig deeper and go higher.
Dig deeper, go higher at comraderocks.net.